Alright, family, sit down, buckle in, put the phone on do not disturb, and get your notes app open, because what you are about to hear is not a diss track recap, it is not a chart position summary, and it is definitely not another lazy who won post from a blogger who wasn't even in the room. This is the autopsy. This is the receipt file. This is the moment we finally admit that the entire Rick Ross versus 50 Cent situation has flipped upside down, inside out, and sideways, and if you have been sleeping on what Rick Ross is doing right now, you are about to feel very, very stupid by the end of this video. So do not scroll. Do not swipe. Do not blink. Because in the next few minutes I am going to walk you, step by step, brick by brick, through the single most misunderstood chess move in modern hip-hop, and I am telling you right now, 50 Cent may have just lost a war he thought he already won, and Rick Ross may have just pulled off the greatest reputation reversal since Jay-Z walked back into the booth after retirement. This is not a hot take. This is a forensic breakdown. And by the time we get to the end, you are going to look at Rick Ross completely differently, you are going to look at 50 Cent completely differently, and you are going to understand exactly why the industry, the culture, and the algorithm are all quietly repositioning themselves around Rick Ross this month. Let me set the table. Rick Ross just dropped his 12th solo studio album, Set in Stone, and the first week numbers did what the first week numbers did. Billboard clocked it at number 39 on the Billboard 200. Not top 10. Not top 20. Not top 30. Number 39. And the second the ink dried on that chart, the internet lit up like a switchboard, the blogs sharpened their knives, the podcasts recorded their reaction episodes, and every single hip-hop commentator on the platform ran to their microphones to tell you Rick Ross was cooked. Rick Ross was finished. Rick Ross was over. 50 Cent hopped on his channels within hours, cracked his usual grin, and did what 50 Cent has done for the better part of 2 decades, he twisted the knife. Because for Curtis Jackson, this was not a chart position. This was a punchline. This was ammunition. This was the exact kind of Monday morning he lives for. This is what 50 Cent wakes up praying for. And on paper only, it looked like Rick Ross had just handed his oldest opponent the loudest headline of the year. But here is where the story gets slippery, because the numbers on the chart and the numbers on the streaming report are telling 2 very different stories, and if you are only reading the Billboard headline, you are reading half the book. You are reading the cover. You are reading the tagline. You are not reading the actual chapters. Rick Ross pulled up the receipts himself. 63.5 million streams inside the first 2 weeks of Set in Stone. 63.5 million. That is not a whisper. That is not a lull. That math, when you actually run it through the album equivalent calculator, works out to roughly 42,500 units, and that is before you factor in a single physical product moved off a shelf, before you count a single vinyl, a single CD, a single bundle sold through the Maybach Music Group store. Break that down further and you are looking at something like 22,000 units the first week and 20,000 the second. And here is the part nobody is saying loud enough, family, that is not a drop. That is not a fall off. That is not a slide. That is a distance runner keeping his pace. That is marathon math. That is the exact opposite of the boom and bust chart pattern that so many of these inflated first weeks are hiding behind. Because in the streaming era, week 2 tells you the truth. Week 2 tells you if the bots were on, if the playlists were paid, if the numbers were real. Week 1 lies. Week 2 confesses. And Rick Ross just held serve in week 2. And that, family, is where Rick Ross is quietly rewriting the rules while everybody is busy laughing at the headline. Let me back up, because to understand why Rick Ross is playing this hand the way he is playing it, you have to understand what Rick Ross actually is, and what Rick Ross actually is not, in the year we are living in right now. Rick Ross is not a hitmaker in the traditional Billboard sense anymore. That era for Rick Ross closed somewhere between Teflon Don and Mastermind. Nobody serious is arguing that Rick Ross is going to open at number 1 the way he did on Port of Miami, or Trilla, or Deeper Than Rap. Those days, for Rick Ross, are archival. They are canon. They are museum pieces. They are frozen in amber and they will stay that way. But, and this is the part the culture keeps missing, the part the reaction videos keep skipping over, the part the tabloids do not want to admit, Rick Ross is still one of the most respected rap voices alive. Rick Ross still has 14 top 10 appearances on the top rap albums chart. Rick Ross still commands rooms. Rick Ross still books the flights. Rick Ross still gets the beats delivered to the door. Rick Ross still has the phone number of every producer who matters. Rick Ross still has DJ Khaled on speed dial. Rick Ross still runs Maybach Music. And Rick Ross, right now, is doing something on Instagram that not one single one of his peers is doing at his level, and he is doing it while the entire internet is trying to write his obituary in real time. Peep this. Rick Ross has been chopping up his own album into bite-sized promotional clips, rolling out songs one by one. Sitting on the throne up on Star Island, sunset in the background, walking you through why a specific record made the final cut of Set in Stone. Rick Ross opened up the studio, opened up the credits, and started walking the audience through the making of the record like it is a masterclass on late-career artistry. He talks about how the beat from The Dream just hit him, how the production sounded like caviar, how the collaboration turned around in a day, how the chorus came back and unlocked the verses. He shows you the process. He shows you the pen. He shows you the artistry. That is not a rapper begging for streams. That is a mogul teaching a marketing class in real time. That is a distance runner showing his splits. That is Rick Ross saying to the algorithm, I know exactly what you reward, and I am going to feed you exactly what you eat. And every single day for the next month, Rick Ross is going to keep dropping another one of those clips, and every single one of those clips is going to farm engagement for the album that the chart position told you was dead. And here is the punchline, Rick Ross is using the same rollout blueprint that Curtis Jackson himself pioneered 10 years ago. Rick Ross is running 50 Cent's own playbook against him. Rick Ross has been watching 50 Cent build television empires, sneaker deals, liquor lines, and boxing cards for over a decade, and Rick Ross has finally figured out the master key, you do not sell an album anymore. You sell a lifestyle package, and the album is a chapter of the package. That is the pivot. That is the new gospel. And Rick Ross, 20 years in, just picked it up and started running with it while everybody was busy watching the chart position. The student became the study. The target became the analyst. The man 50 Cent used to laugh at is now teaching a version of the same course 50 Cent taught him, and doing it from a balcony on Star Island with a sunset behind him. Now let me talk to you about the actual response Rick Ross gave to 50 Cent this week, because it is being slept on, and it is being slept on hard. Rick Ross did not fire back with a diss track. Rick Ross did not rush into the studio. Rick Ross did not go on somebody's podcast and get baited into a shouting match. Rick Ross did not tweet, delete, tweet again, or subtweet. Rick Ross did something far more surgical. Rick Ross went on camera, cool as an ocean breeze, and turned the conversation into a business seminar. Rick Ross said, and I am paraphrasing the essence of it, that a lot of these first-week explosions in the game right now are fueled by inflation, by bot numbers, by streaming farms and playlist manipulation and marketing budgets that would embarrass a Fortune 500 company. Rick Ross said the new flex is no bots. Rick Ross said the new flex is the music actually fighting your battles for you. And then Rick Ross went one level higher. Rick Ross pointed out, correctly, that if the audience size some of these artists are claiming was real, then the sneakers would sell, the liquor would sell, the merchandise would sell, the everything outside the music would sell. Rick Ross took the entire economic model of the modern rap superstar and cracked it open on camera without ever raising his voice. Rick Ross did what only a boss can do. Rick Ross made the argument about business, not bars. And listen, that is a chess move. Rick Ross gestured at the Bumba bottle, at the Luc Belair, at the Wingstop empire, at the Star Island real estate portfolio, and Rick Ross said, in effect, I do not need a #1 album to eat, because I built a table long before I needed the plate. Rick Ross does not need Billboard to validate him because Rick Ross owns Maybach Music, owns his masters, owns his land, owns his brand, and owns his time. That is a level of independence that most rappers who chart at #1 this year will not have when they turn 40. That is not the sound of a man losing. That is the sound of a man who already won and is now teaching the class. Now let me pull the camera back, because to appreciate where Rick Ross is standing right now, we have to walk you all the way back to where this thing between Rick Ross and 50 Cent actually started. Because 2 Octobers from now, this beef will officially be 20 years old. 2 decades. 2 entire generations of hip-hop have grown up watching Rick Ross and 50 Cent throw haymakers at each other, and there is not a single soul on this planet who thinks this rivalry is dying down anytime soon. This is going to outlive their careers. This is going to outlive their kids' careers. This is the Ollie versus Frazier of the streaming era, except neither man has ever fully conceded a round. And to be clear, the reason it will not die is because it began with a look. Not a lyric. Not a leak. Not a business dispute. A look. The year was 2008. The place was the BET Awards. Rick Ross was standing in the back, doing what rap stars did in that era, chopping it up with DJ Khaled, running the crew live, holding court in the corners the cameras did not reach. Rick Ross was in his element. Rick Ross was Miami's ambassador for the night. And according to Rick Ross himself, 50 Cent walked past and gave Rick Ross a look. That is it. A glance. A moment. A vibe check that did not clear. And instead of walking over and squaring it up in person, instead of pulling 50 Cent to the side and saying what is the problem, Rick Ross took that glance to the studio. Rick Ross took that glance to Mafia music. Rick Ross took that glance and turned it into a set of bars aimed straight at Curtis Jackson's baby mama, straight at his kids, straight at his home life. Rick Ross rapped about paying rent, about baby mamas, about burning houses down. Rick Ross went nuclear on the very first track. Rick Ross did not throw a jab. Rick Ross threw a haymaker at a man who had spent the previous 8 years turning the entire industry into rubble. And what did 50 Cent do? 50 Cent did what 50 Cent does. 50 Cent went to the meme factory. 50 Cent invented Officer Ricky. 50 Cent invented Pimpin' Curly. 50 Cent went shopping with Rick Ross's ex, put her in a fur coat, sat her on a couch, and turned a book deal into a documentary. 50 Cent went digital before digital was a weapon, before TikTok was a company, before Instagram had a video button. 50 Cent turned the internet into a stadium and Rick Ross into the visiting team. 50 Cent invented the modern rap troll, and Rick Ross was the beta test. Everything you watch 50 Cent do to Diddy today, to Ja Rule, to anybody who crosses him, Rick Ross was the prototype. Rick Ross was the first draft. Rick Ross was the origin story of 50 Cent the internet villain. And then the correction officer photo surfaced. And Rick Ross, at first, denied. Rick Ross, at first, dodged. Rick Ross tried to laugh it off, tried to reframe it, tried to bury it. But the photos existed. The badge existed. The timeline existed. And 50 Cent had every single receipt. And then Rick Ross, to his credit, addressed it, not perfectly, not gracefully, but honestly, with a record where Rick Ross rapped about kept a nice watch, sold crack for some nice kicks, and eventually built himself into the CEO he is now. Rick Ross did not clean it up. Rick Ross rewrote it into the origin story. Rick Ross took the L and turned it into a chapter of the mythology. And that, right there, is why Rick Ross is still standing today. Because Rick Ross understood, before most rappers of his era understood, that the biography is not what you are handed, the biography is what you author. Rick Ross took the worst leak of his career and used it as the foundation of the second half of his career. That is not luck. That is not accident. That is authorship. Now, and this is important, family, this is critical, Rick Ross has stumbled since then. Rick Ross is not a saint. Rick Ross has picked fights he did not need. Rick Ross swung at Drake, and it went nowhere. Rick Ross swung at Trick Daddy, and it looked petty and it looked small and it looked beneath the position Rick Ross had built for himself. Rick Ross swung at Birdman, and the culture shrugged. Those were unforced errors for Rick Ross. Those were the rounds where Rick Ross wasted stamina on opponents who did not deserve the airtime. And there is a whole generation of listeners who tuned out of Rick Ross somewhere in the middle of those detours. That is real. That has to be acknowledged. Rick Ross has, at multiple points in the last 5 years, punched down when he should have been strategizing up. Rick Ross has, at multiple points, given oxygen to people who should have been suffocated by silence. But here is what can't be denied, the Rick Ross we are watching right now, in the Set in Stone rollout, is not that Rick Ross. This Rick Ross is patient. This Rick Ross is deliberate. This Rick Ross is playing the promotional game with the calm of a man who has watched 3 cycles of the industry rise and fall from his balcony. And Rick Ross may be about to turn a chart flop into a cultural comeback, because the numbers are going to keep working while the noise dies down. Streams do not care about opening weekend. Streams compound. Streams are interest-bearing. Streams are the 20-year retirement plan. And Rick Ross has always been, above everything else, a long-term investor. Rick Ross has always understood that the album is the down payment, not the closing price. Rick Ross has always understood that the real money in the modern music business is not in the debut, it is in the residual, the sync, the catalog, the licensing, the tour, the merch, the endorsement, and the eventual sale of the masters when the offer gets fat enough. Now let me be honest with you, because if I lie to you this whole video is worthless. The album is not perfect. Set in Stone is not Teflon Don. Set in Stone is not deeper than rap. Set in Stone is not the Rick Ross ceiling. The beats, for me, are the weakest link. The beat selection, which used to be Rick Ross's absolute superpower, does not sound like the Rick Ross of old. Rick Ross used to sit shoulder to shoulder with Fat Joe and Bun B as one of the greatest beat pickers of the modern era. Rick Ross used to walk into a studio, hear a Cool and Dre instrumental, and know within 8 bars that it was going to be a movie. Rick Ross used to pick beats the way Scorsese picks scores, with instinct, with cinema, with weight. The Rick Ross on Set in Stone does not have that same batting average. Some of these beats do not slap the way Rick Ross beats used to slap. Some of these instrumentals sound like they were pulled off a producer's B-list. And that is a problem. That is a legitimate problem. That is not shade, that is a diagnosis. Because Rick Ross the rapper is still elite, but Rick Ross the executive producer of his own sonic identity has slipped, and it is fixable, and it needs to be fixed before the next record drops. Because when I compare it to a Drake rollout, or a Kendrick Lamar rollout, those two have entire in-house teams engineering the sonic identity of every single record. There is a Drake beat. There is a Kendrick beat. Those are locked. Those are branded. You can hear a snare in the first 4 bars and you know whose record it is. Rick Ross used to have that too. Rick Ross had that Miami maximalist wall of sound signature that made you know it was a Rick Ross record within 4 seconds of the intro. The horns. The strings. The chopped soul. The J Dilla ghost floating through certain Justice League productions. And on Set in Stone, that signature is muted. That signature is diluted. That signature needs to come back. Full stop. If Rick Ross wants the next album to be the actual redemption arc, Rick Ross needs to lock the sound. Rick Ross needs to call Cool and Dre back. Rick Ross needs to call Justic League back. Rick Ross needs the DJ Tump records. Rick Ross needs the Static Selecta records. Rick Ross needs the No ID records. Rick Ross needs to reassemble the beat cabinet that made him a legend, and then Rick Ross needs to write over them like his life depends on it. But, and here is where it gets interesting, family, Rick Ross has a lever nobody is talking about, and if Rick Ross pulls this lever, Set in Stone flips into a slow burn success story that nobody in August is going to see coming. Here is the lever. Rick Ross should stop rolling out the songs from a promotional throne on Star Island, and start dropping snippets, 30-second, 40-second, 60-second cuts, as native Instagram Reels and TikToks. Not YouTube long form. Not sit-down explainers. Micro-content. Sub-minute clips. The exact same format that pushed Sexy Red, Glorilla, and half of the newer generation to platinum. Because Rick Ross has one of the most recognizable voices in modern rap. Rick Ross does not need a 5-minute video to sell you a song. Rick Ross needs 8 bars, a Star Island sunset, and a caption. That is the missing piece. That is the pivot Rick Ross has not made yet, and it is the pivot that would take him from playing the algorithm to hacking it. Because the algorithm rewards 2 things above everything else, completion rate and reshare velocity. Sub-minute clips are engineered for both. A 20-second Rick Ross clip with the right hook and the right visual could do more for the album this month than 100 long-form YouTube reaction videos. And this is where 50 Cent should be nervous, because if Rick Ross figures out that final piece, if Rick Ross adds the Reels engine to the long-game strategy Rick Ross is already running, the entire narrative flips. Because right now, the only thing 50 Cent has going for him in this particular round is the chart headline. And chart headlines have a shelf life of about 72 hours. A chart headline is a firework. It is bright, it is loud, and it is gone by the weekend. But a Rick Ross record that catches fire on Reels 4 months from now? That does not have a shelf life. That is a slow-burning candle. That is a compounding asset. That is the kind of second life that has resurrected careers Rick Ross's age all across the last 3 years of the industry. Ask Ludacris. Ask Nelly. Ask Fabulous. Ask any legacy artist who ever had a track quietly detonate on short form 6 months after release. Ask any of them what the record did for their touring numbers the following year. That is the ecosystem Rick Ross is one strategic post away from unlocking. Talk to me in the comments. Do you think Rick Ross is going to make that pivot? Do you think Rick Ross has the ear left to hear that advice? Or do you think Rick Ross is going to keep leaning on the throne clips and let this window close on him? Because the window is real. The window is open. And I do not think it stays open past September. And I want the answer from you specifically, because this is your culture, this is your archive, and this is your call. Drop it below. I read every one of them. Now, meanwhile, 50 Cent is doing exactly what 50 Cent has always done. 50 Cent is trolling. 50 Cent is running his usual campaign of Instagram captions, memes, and calculated jabs, and to be fair to 50 Cent, nobody in the history of rap has ever weaponized social media the way Curtis Jackson has weaponized social media. That is a legitimate skill. That is a Hall of Fame skill. 50 Cent turned Officer Ricky into a decade-long referendum. 50 Cent turned Instagram comments into cultural events. 50 Cent turned petty into a business model. And it worked. For a long time, it worked flawlessly. 50 Cent built television shows off of the same energy. 50 Cent built liquor deals off of the same energy. 50 Cent built the Power franchise, the BMF franchise, the entire Stars empire, partly on the back of the character he perfected while trolling Rick Ross. But here is the crack in the armor. 50 Cent's own sneaker line, the G-Unit sneakers, are, by his own admission, sitting in the Costco pipeline. And when you are the man who built the loudest anti-fraud campaign in modern hip-hop, and your own physical product ends up on the discount rack, you have to be careful about which glass houses you throw stones from. That is not shade. That is a math problem. 50 Cent has built an empire, no question, but the empire is uneven. The empire has soft spots. The empire has warehouses full of inventory that did not move. And Rick Ross, quietly, is starting to poke at those spots on camera. Rick Ross made a very specific comment about Lloyd Banks deserving his own high top. Rick Ross made a very specific comment about the Shreveport situation. Rick Ross made a very specific comment about 50 Cent's focus, or lack thereof. Rick Ross is doing the exact thing 50 Cent used to do to Rick Ross. Rick Ross is finding the joke inside the man. Rick Ross is finding the pressure point. Rick Ross is finding the seam in the tailored suit, and Rick Ross is pulling at the thread. And that, family, is a reversal you do not see coming from a mile away. Here's what can't be denied: Rick Ross has learned, and 50 Cent may not have realized Rick Ross has learned. For 15 years, Rick Ross was the one getting outmaneuvered on the internet. For 15 years, Rick Ross was reacting, not initiating. For 15 years, 50 Cent was the sniper and Rick Ross was the target. 15 years of getting picked apart on Instagram. 15 years of getting memed into oblivion. 15 years of watching 50 Cent turn every misstep into content. And now Rick Ross has picked up the rifle. Rick Ross has learned the meme game. Rick Ross has learned the caption game. Rick Ross has learned the sub-minute clip game. And Rick Ross, on top of all of that, still has the one weapon 50 Cent has never had at scale. Rick Ross can actually still make music that moves the culture. Rick Ross is still respected in the rap conversation in a way that 50 Cent, to be blunt, has not been in the last decade. 50 Cent has not dropped a critically consequential album in years. 50 Cent has not had a song of the summer in years. 50 Cent has not been in the current artist conversation in years. Rick Ross just dropped one that the streets are still processing. And when the streets are still processing your album 6 months from now, the number 39 debut becomes a footnote. The number 39 debut becomes a trivia question. The number 39 debut becomes the thing chart nerds bring up to sound smart, while the actual songs are running in every barbershop, every corner store, every drive down Collins Avenue, every South Beach club, every Wingstop parking lot. The chart is a snapshot. The catalog is the movie. And Rick Ross has always been in the movie business. Now here is where I need you to sit up and pay attention, because this is the piece nobody is telling you. This is the piece the other commentary channels either do not see or do not want to say out loud. The reason 50 Cent keeps pressing the Rick Ross story is not because 50 Cent thinks Rick Ross is over. 50 Cent knows Rick Ross is not over. 50 Cent has watched Rick Ross survive federal-level scrutiny, survive the correction officer reveal, survive a health scare, survive record label politics, survive multiple beef cycles, and survive the transition from CD sales to streaming. 50 Cent knows Rick Ross is a cockroach in the best possible sense. Rick Ross does not die. Rick Ross adapts. Rick Ross survives. So the reason 50 Cent keeps pressing is because 50 Cent needs the content. 50 Cent's brand is built on the tension. 50 Cent's brand is built on the running joke. And Rick Ross is the character Curtis Jackson has been playing off of the longest. If 50 Cent lets the Rick Ross story die, 50 Cent loses one of his most reliable engagement engines. That is the truth. That is the machinery under the machinery. That is what nobody wants to say out loud because it complicates the narrative. Which means, and this is a wild thought, family, sit with this one for a second, Rick Ross may be more valuable to 50 Cent alive and rapping than he is dead and retired. Rick Ross may be, unwittingly or knowingly, the co-star in a Curtis Jackson script that has been running since 2008. Rick Ross may be a permanent fixture in 50 Cent's content mill whether Rick Ross ever charts again or not. And Rick Ross, in this current phase, seems to finally understand that. Rick Ross is not playing angry anymore. Rick Ross is playing amused. Rick Ross is playing detached. Rick Ross is playing like a man who has finally realized that the noise is the promotion, and the promotion is free. Rick Ross is letting 50 Cent do his marketing for him, and Rick Ross is not even paying an invoice for it. That is judo. That is diplomatic warfare. That is the kind of move you only make after you have lost enough rounds to know exactly how the fight is scored. The game teaches, and the game corrects. Rick Ross has been corrected many times. Rick Ross has been humbled. Rick Ross has been laughed at. Rick Ross has been memed into oblivion. Rick Ross has been the punchline of 1,000 comment threads. And Rick Ross, standing on his own island in the middle of Biscayne Bay, watching the sunset with Set in Stone playing in the background, does not look like a man who lost. Rick Ross looks like a man who understands, finally, that the war of words is not the war that matters. The war that matters is the war of catalog. And in the war of catalog, Rick Ross has 15 top 10 rap albums, 20 years of hits, a top-shelf feature reel, a producer roster that reads like a Grammy panel, and a brand ecosystem that pays whether the album charts or not. So when 50 Cent laughs at the 39, Rick Ross does the math on the 20-year runway. When 50 Cent posts the meme, Rick Ross posts the sunset. When 50 Cent chases the daily win, Rick Ross runs the marathon math. When 50 Cent tries to spike the football in the end zone, Rick Ross is quietly walking the sideline making sure the next quarter is on the calendar. And somewhere in the middle of that contrast, the audience, the actual audience, the one that decides these things, starts quietly shifting sides. Slowly. Quietly. But it is happening. You can feel it in the comment sections. You can feel it in the reposts. You can feel it in the way that even Rick Ross's harshest critics are starting to say, okay, this rollout is different. This posture is different. This is not the Rick Ross who used to lose the internet war. This is a new Rick Ross. And this Rick Ross is dangerous in a way the old Rick Ross never was. Because a rapper who has been humbled and adjusted is more dangerous than a rapper who never lost. That is a rule of the game. That is one of the oldest rules of the game. Ask Jay-Z. Ask Nas. Ask any legacy artist who took a chart hit and turned it into a second act. Ask LL Cool J. Ask Snoop. Ask any of the OGs who watched their opening weekend collapse and then still walked into the next decade with more leverage than they had before. Rick Ross has all the ingredients for that second act right in front of him. All Rick Ross has to do is pick them up. All Rick Ross has to do is reach out and grab them. And I want to be clear about one more thing before I let you go. I am not writing 50 Cent off. I would never write 50 Cent off. That would be the dumbest bet in modern hip-hop. 50 Cent is one of the sharpest operators in the entire entertainment industry, full stop, period, end of debate. 50 Cent will find the next angle. 50 Cent will run the next campaign. 50 Cent will pull another shot out of a hat that nobody sees coming. That is who Curtis Jackson is. That is who Curtis Jackson has always been. That is who Curtis Jackson will always be. But in this specific round, in this specific news cycle, in this specific window of Set in Stone versus the chart headline versus the Rick Ross rollout, Rick Ross may have just outplayed him. Not by shouting. Not by rapping. Not by dropping a diss. By posture. By patience. By posting a sunset when everybody expected a diss track. By pulling up receipts when everybody expected excuses. By running the marathon while everybody else was still stretching for the sprint. That, family, is the move. That is the shift. That is the reason the Rick Ross story is not the story you thought it was when you clicked this video. Let me give you one more layer, because I do not want you leaving this video without the full context. Rick Ross, right now, is sitting on assets that make the number 39 debut look completely irrelevant on the balance sheet. Rick Ross owns the Wingstop portfolio. Rick Ross owns the Checkers portfolio. Rick Ross owns the Bumbu equity. Rick Ross owns Luke Belair equity through the Sovereign Branch relationship. Rick Ross owns real estate in Fayetteville, in Atlanta, in Miami. Rick Ross owns cars that appreciate. Rick Ross owns the Maybach Music Masters he was smart enough to structure early. And Rick Ross, on top of all of that, has a book deal, a podcast, a car show, and an annual event circuit that pays whether he ever drops another album or not. Rick Ross does not need Set in Stone to feed his family for the next 20 years. Rick Ross needed Set in Stone to remind the culture that Rick Ross the artist is still active, and Rick Ross the artist just accomplished that. Not through chart position. Through conversation. Through virality. Through the exact conversation you and I are having right now. Because think about it, you clicked this video. You are still watching this video. You are going to leave a comment on this video. You are going to send this video to somebody. And every single one of those actions is a data point that tells the algorithm the Rick Ross story is trending, that the Rick Ross album is trending, that the Rick Ross versus 50 Cent conversation is trending. That is free marketing. That is uncatchable marketing. That is the kind of marketing that $10 million of Instagram budget could not buy. Rick Ross is winning the discourse cycle even while losing the chart cycle, and the discourse cycle is what actually moves records in 2026. And now let me tell you something that is going to change the way you view every future Rick Ross release. Rick Ross is not going to change strategies. Rick Ross is going to double down. Rick Ross is going to keep dropping albums. Rick Ross is going to keep chopping them into content. Rick Ross is going to keep posting from Star Island. Rick Ross is going to keep giving business seminars disguised as diss responses. Rick Ross is going to keep letting 50 Cent do the promotion for free. Rick Ross has locked in a rhythm that costs him almost nothing and generates almost everything. That is the definition of a scalable strategy. That is the definition of leverage. That is the definition of a boss. Now, drop your take in the comments. Are you actually listening to Set in Stone? Are you giving Rick Ross the second spin the album deserves, or are you letting the chart headline decide it for you? Which song on the album is your song? Which record deserves the Reels rollout? Which producer needs to come back into Rick Ross's cabinet for the next album? Because I am telling you right now, I am going back in on this record. I am going to sit with it without the beat criticism in my head. I am going to hear the writing. I am going to hear the pen. I am going to hear the storytelling. Because Rick Ross the writer, Rick Ross the storyteller, Rick Ross the Miami documentarian, that Rick Ross is still one of the best in the building. That Rick Ross is still worth the time. That Rick Ross is still one of the top 3 narrative rappers of his generation, and I will die on that hill. And I want to know one more thing from you before you go. Whose side are you actually on now? Not who you were on in 2008. Not who you were on in 2015. Now. Today. In this window. In this news cycle. Are you with Rick Ross the strategist or with 50 Cent the troll? Because those are the two options, and pretending it is anything else is dishonest. Drop the answer in the comments, and be honest, because I am reading them, and I am going to feature the sharpest takes in the follow-up video. And listen, if you thought this was a wild breakdown, wait until you see what I have next on Curtis Jackson's Costco pipeline, the G-Unit sneaker rollout, and the very quiet reason 50 Cent may be pivoting away from music entirely and into a corporate media play that nobody is ready for. That story is going to break the internet, and I am going to break it here first, on this channel, before anybody else runs it. Click the video that pops up next, because we are not done, we are just getting warmed up. Talk to me in the comments, tell me whose side you are actually on now, hit that subscribe if you have not already, ring the bell so you do not miss the next one, and I will catch you on the very next one. Rick Ross vs 50 Cent, Part 2 is coming, and it is going to be the receipt file nobody in the industry wants me to publish. Stay tuned. Stay locked in. And do not sleep on the boss.